Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we're going to have a special episode to commemorate and to announce the launching of a new book. This book is by Martin Gansten. Welcome and congratulations for your new publication. And the book is called The Jewel of Annual Astrology, and it's a book on it's a critical edition of an important work on the Hindu, and you perhaps can clarify this a little bit better than me, into the Hindu astrological practices which have a Persian and Arabic influence. So we're talking about a specific practice of astrology which has these Arabic Persian influences, and it's somewhat different than the usual traditional Hindu practice. So the Jewel of Annual Astrology, it's available by Brill. Here it is, a cover, but it is available for download, for free download as a PDF because it has been released in open access, which is excellent, I must say. So Martin, welcome, and again, congratulations for the new publication.
Thank you.
I must say I liked a lot your introduction. It was very. I think you summarize a very complex, several complex subjects on the history of astrology in quite an elegant way, I must say. I liked a lot. I think that came out quite well. And you do make a statement that I would like perhaps to start and address that first before we go into the book itself, which is astrology as part of religion, at least in a contemporary point of view. Could you please just elaborate exactly what you mean and what's your idea on that topic?
Well, as I discussed in the introduction, there are basically two types of scholars today studying the history of astrology. Either you're interested in the history of religion or the history of science. Mm-hmm. And I mean, people's institutional affiliations will vary. Some people will be classicists, others will be Arabists, and so on. But usually they're either interested in the broader themes of the history of science or in the history of religion. Mm-hmm. And irrespective of which, they often find themselves in the position of having to defend the fact that they're researching the history of astrology. Yeah. Because if you say you're a historian of science, then people will say, but astrology isn't science. Mm-hmm. And again, if you're a historian of religion, people will say, what has astrology got to do with religion? Mm-hmm. And that's actually happened to me. I'm a historian of religion. Mm-hmm. And that's actually happened to me a number of times. So I felt I wanted to get that out of the way. Mm-hmm. Actually start discussing this on page 1, just to sort of get this out of the way. And of course, religion in the modern world, in the modern Western world, because religion is a Western concept. Religion is it's not a very old. I mean, the word is old, but the concept as we use it today is not very old. It's basically a post-Enlightenment. It dates from the 18th century or so. The current use of the word religion and the sorts of meanings that we tend to associate with the word. So, and it's culture specific, really. I mean, if you do cross-cultural studies of any kind, you will run into this difficulty that in many languages around the world, there isn't really a word that exactly matches this word religion that we use in the West. Um, so when we try to classify astrology, to find the right box to put it into, the question is, does it belong in the religion box, or doesn't it? Well, it depends on how you define religion, obviously. But I think there are some reasons why it does fit into that box, although it's not the only box. and that's, as I discussed in that introduction, that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
That's what really bothers many people about astrology. That is, it doesn't really fit in with our modern idea of religion, nor does it fit in with our modern idea of science.
Of science, yeah, exactly.
But as I discussed in that introduction, the points that I think qualify astrology as a subject to discuss within the history of religion is that it deals with questions that in our society, in our modern Western society, are not discussed anywhere else. That is questions of meaning, of life as a meaningful narrative, of fate and free will, these sort of questions, which by and large are not even discussed by philosophers anymore. It's just within the sphere of religion.
Of course. I think that's a large problem with astrology, and specifically when you try to do an academic study, is that, well, you can see it from a number of points of view, religion being one of them, science the other. These two probably are the major ones at this point. But I think what we're missing here in general with all this research is that astrology has to fit in its own category at a certain point, because that's the problem. It's not exactly this, it's not exactly that, it has a bit of something else, and it gets very difficult to fit it in some place, because if you fit it as science, you are going to deny aspects which in other contexts, for example, the context you study, the Hindu context, have a completely different positioning, and the same thing. But at the same time, you cannot put it in completely as a belief or as a way of life, because then there is a mathematical and scientific background that has to support it. So it stays in this no man's land of this as a discipline, when perhaps we should look at it as its own thing, as a unique corpus of knowledge that has all these characteristics.
And of course, the problem. Sorry. The problem here is that these categories, the category of science and the category of religion and so on, are actually more modern than astrology. They were invented at a later stage. Yeah. So astrology is an old traditional knowledge, and it arose before we had these neat boxes of science and religion.
Yeah, exactly. And even in the larger category of esotericism, in which we have a whole line of study nowadays in the academia, it still fits. Again, it's the same problem. It fits partially, but then there are certain practices that are not exactly suitable for that category. So again,
I was coming to that actually. Today, in the context of Western culture, especially, if astrology is studied academically, it's usually relegated to this area of esotericism, which, as you say, isn't a perfect fit even in the West, but it's even less of a fit in India, for instance, where there is absolutely no esoteric component to astrology. I'm not sure if we discussed this in our last conversation. We may have done, actually, so I won't repeat that.
Yeah, of course. And today our focus is really another, but I think this would be, I wanted to highlight this point because I think it's of interest, because this book, its historical context does challenge how we fit astrology into these different academic categories. So I think that's a good point to start. And now going to to the book itself. So we're talking about the practice, a second wave, as you describe it, of incoming astrological knowledge into context, which happens sometime around the 10th century, 10th, 13th century, if I recall correctly.
That's right. Between those, we don't know exactly when the transmission began. We know that we're fairly sure that the earliest preserved Sanskrit work on this type of astrology dates to the 13th century.
Yeah.
And we know for a fact that the Arabic astrological texts that were the basis of that transmission were written in the 9th century. So probably the transmission was somewhere between the 10th and the 13th centuries to the westernmost part of India.
So we're probably talking more or less about the time when we have in Europe, on the other extreme, the translations from Arabic in the Iberian Peninsula, and so they're more or less contemporary.
Contemporaneous, and that's an interesting, that's a fascinating aspect of it. Actually, the transmission of Arabic language, astrology, and astronomy went both eastward and westward approximately at the same time. And sometime in the 14th century, for instance, I don't remember the exact date now, but sometime in the 14th century, you have Geoffrey Chaucer in England writing his treatise on the astrolabe.
Yeah.
And just a few decades before that, we have the first Indian treatise on the astrolabe, being written by a Jain monk, actually, a scholar called Mahendra Suri. So we have these transmissions more or less in parallel.
Yes.
And it's interesting to compare them.
Yeah, it is. It is quite interesting. That's one of the things that pop into mind. So we're seeing the expansion, or at least the transmission and of a knowledge, of a certain form of knowledge, at the same time to two extremes of its core. Which is it's quite interesting at this point. And so the Jewel is a later work. So we are talking about something which is already a collection or a development of this practice throughout a few centuries since its introduction. So why did you choose specifically to translate this work and not an earlier treatise?
That's a good question. It would have been great to be able to translate the earliest Tajika treatise. Tajika is the name given in India to this. Excuse me, to this Perso-Arabic style of astrology. Unfortunately, that earliest treatise, we know it existed, we know who wrote it, but it's no longer extant. We have fragments of it preserved, especially one part of it that was later attributed to a different author, but we have quotations and well, as I said, fragments of different kinds. Yes. But not the whole thing. So the reason I chose to translate Balabhadra's work is that it's encyclopedic in scope. It's what is known in Sanskrit as a nibandha. So a nibandha is Jonardon Ganeri, who is a British philosopher, I do think British, I recall correctly, describes it as a meta-commentary. So India has a very strong, traditionally Indian scholarship, has a very strong tradition of writing commentaries. If you want to bring out your ideas, more often than not, instead of writing an original work, you latch on to someone else's work that is already established as authoritative, and you write a commentary on it.
Yeah.
And you sort of piggyback on the earlier authority to get your ideas out. Okay, so the commentarial tradition in India is very strong. And a nibandha is what you call a meta-commentary, meaning that you take an entire branch of knowledge, or a philosophical school or whatever, and you try to summarize all the important points, including the various areas of contention, questions on which different authorities have different ideas, and you sort of put them all together and discuss which of them is right, and you try to make a sort of final conclusion or conclusive version. And that is what Balabhadra was doing in the mid-17th century. By that time, Tajika had been around for something like 400 years in India. And the text that is actually the most popular and authoritative today on this type of astrology, and has been for a very long time, is not Balabhadra's text. It's a work written by his teacher's brother, whose name was Nilakantha. Nilakantha was court astrologer to the Emperor Akbar. So a very prestigious position. But Balabhadra quotes more or less the whole thing, or very large parts of that work, but he quotes about 40 other works as well on Tajika. He brings them all together and tries to synthesize the whole state of the art as he knew it. His work was too long to become very popular. It's something like in different I worked with different manuscripts, and there's something like between 200 and 300 folios each. So which for a Sanskrit work is quite long. Typically Sanskrit works are very concise in the modes of expressing themselves. Sanskrit lends itself very easily to a compact way of expressing things. But still, this is a very large work. So people naturally preferred works that were more concise and could be copied with less.
Without 300 folios of text.
Didn't have to pay the scribe for time and work. But it's very useful. Balabhadra's work is very useful because it draws in all this material from all these different sources, some of which I have been completely unable to locate a single manuscript today. I'm sure there are some manuscripts somewhere in India, but getting hold of them is a different question. And especially these days, if you're a non-Indian scholar trying to locate manuscripts in India can be very difficult for bureaucratic reasons.
Okay. Okay.
So they will say, yes, we have it, but you can't access it. Sorry.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, so I was looking at it. Was impressed for the number of citations he does. So he makes a huge number of references throughout the work, and I imagine that was one of the reasons as well why you selected it, because then you have a whole lineage of tradition
Yes.
in this specific form of astrology, which you can go about and see exactly where he's getting his sources and
Yes.
his and it is interesting. Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry, and they're from different centuries. So he quotes Samarasimha, who was the earliest known, or at least one of the two earliest known authors on Thajika in the 13th century, but he also quotes texts from the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. That is some of his contemporaries. So he really without taking a very historical view of Tajik. I mean, he doesn't try to present it like that, say this is how it evolved, but rather in the characteristic Indian fashion, he views it as something more or less static and complete. But nevertheless, from a historian's point of view, the text is useful because it does give this historical overview. You can sort of see how certain ideas evolved, changed over time.
Yeah. That's the point of a later work, and when you can have the lineage and the progress and the evolution, and it's interesting because at the same time as that we had that parallel of the introduction of the Arabic texts and materials at the same time in India and Europe. Also, here we're talking about dates which more or less coinciding the end of the large treatises, so the large pre-modern treatises of astrology in the West. So at the same time, you have, for example, a William Lilly or a Gadbury, which are making a synthesis of the art so far in terms of Western tradition. Here you're having an equivalent or a parallel in another tradition, which is also which also makes an interesting parallel. Of course, they're two different things, but it's still interesting because then you can, in a certain way, pick up on a number of sources that we already have in the West at this period, and with the source of this tradition, of this Indian tradition, and then we can see exactly what's happening in both contexts at a similar period, and itself the comparison is fascinating because it's completely different set of cultural and philosophical backgrounds, and that's quite fascinating as well.
And of course, the main difference at that point, at the point when Balabhadra was writing, that is the mid 17th century, one of the most important differences at that time between India and Europe is that this was actually the end of the golden age of astrology in Europe.
Exactly.
After that, astrology sort of crumbled because astrologers had tied up their view of astrology with the natural philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotelianism, and Aristotelianism came toppling down in the 17th century, and the so-called the new science started to arise, which it wasn't actually incompatible with astrology, as we can see from the fact that several of these proponents of the new science were also practicing astrologers, but astrology had liaised itself with, or allied itself with Aristotelianism, and so it sort of came down with it and fell out of favor. That didn't happen in India.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's the main difference. Astrology continued as a living tradition and still does. And there's when we're speaking about the earliest phase of transmission, there's also a similar difference in that Latin Europe didn't have a prior tradition of astrology. In the Firmicus Maternus, I think there were a few copies of the Latin work of Firmicus Maternus floating around in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, but that was about it, as far as I know. So when these Arabic treatises began to be translated, there was no prior astrological tradition that influenced how they were understood or interpreted. Whereas in India, there was this prior tradition of astrology, and it sort of colored the understanding of Perso-Arabic astrology. So to some extent, you might say that Perso-Arabic astrology was reinterpreted or even misinterpreted in some ways in India, because they wanted to use the old terminology and the old system and the old categories, understand this new system, and sometimes it worked less well.
Yes, I've noticed it. Of course, I didn't have the chance to analyze the contents of the doctrines that he presents in detail, but I did skim through them, and where he reaches the planetary periods, then we see, I think, and you know more than this, I think there you can see where there is a cross influence between what we would expect from the Arabic, Persian-Arabic tradition in terms of Zal and other authors, and then the specific interpretation that we find here, in which the periodization gets much more complex than we can find in Arabic tradition. So I think this echoes very well what already they have in terms of an extensive use of periods, sub-periods, and they are going to transport that as well to these new approaches in some way.
The one thing that wasn't successfully transmitted to India in either of these two waves of transmission, neither from the Hellenistic world nor from the Perso-Arabic world, is the idea of directions, what we know as primary directions, because this way of thinking, the sort of prognostic techniques that are based on motion. I'm not talking about transits here. They did and do have transits, but the symbolic motion of a point around the chart, the way you use it in directions and also in directions, is not present in India, and they really didn't understand it. You can see in the one work that is more or less preserved by this original Indian translator, Samarasimha, in his work on genethliology. He has one chapter where he tries to explain the system of directions. He actually takes this from Abu Bakr. And he completely misunderstands the technique. He doesn't understand the mathematics of it, and he starts to explain directions, and then he mixes it up with Fardar, that is Firdaria, which is a completely different system, but more similar to Dashas, that is Indian planetary periods. So just there was.
It's curious, isn't it? It's curious because it's present in both traditions. It's something that is quite constant throughout the Western lineage of astrology, from Greek, Arabic, and then Latin. It's interesting that it didn't got picked up.
No, it's something that was alien to the mindset of Indian astrologers. I mean, it's not. I didn't mean that to sound as though Indians weren't any good at mathematics because they were excellent.
Yeah, that would not be true. Yeah, of course.
It was for many centuries Indian mathematics generally and mathematical astronomy was way ahead of its European counterparts. So, but
So,
for some reason, the astrologers didn't think in the same way.
yeah. So that's what I thought at first as well. It's not a mathematical problem because you do have a tradition of very good mathematics in India. So that wouldn't be the reason for it. Yeah, it's probably what you're saying. It's the mind frame in which they perceive and structure their interpretation doesn't. It's not. How shall I say it? Doesn't facilitate the acceptance of a different way of thinking. It doesn't fit so well into their perception, so it's not applied. And I would think the same thing could be said about certain ways of thinking of Hindu astrology, which are typical, and then when they're transposed to the West, their acceptance it's always marginal. I was thinking of the so-called Lunar Mansions, which have a huge tradition in India, and in the West they exist, they're used, but they are not one of the mainstream techniques that you would find in a normal standard interpretation. They pop up in very specific pockets of uses like talismans, elections sometimes, but still, even in those contexts, they're not mainstream. While in the Hindu tradition, they're part of the core techniques, as would be essential dignities to the West tradition. So probably it has to do with the way that the machine has already been constructed around a certain concept.
And it's often difficult to unlearn things. I mean, we can see the same thing when people who know modern astrology try to understand traditional astrology, for instance. Many times there are areas. I mean, obviously, if you have some grounding in astrology, that can be a help. But in some respects, in some areas, it can actually be more of a snag, and you have to sort of learn things.
There is a good example of that misunderstanding, which is when in an historical document you see that, for example, the king was born under the sign of Cancer. Most historians nowadays, and even sometimes historians of astrology, assume that they're talking about the position of the sun in that sign, while the great majority, in the great majority of cases, they're talking about the rising sign and not the so-called solar sign, which is a concept that is pop culture nowadays. So it's quite embedded in our minds as a format, as a produce of pop culture, and the brain immediately switched to what he knows best. And in that context, that doesn't make any sense. And this is something which is very simple, but it's an error that sometimes comes about. And I think it illustrates very well what you were saying.
Yes. The problem is when you think you understand something, and, when you know you don't understand it, then you take the time to, hopefully to understand, to investigate. But when you think you understand something, that's very dangerous. So.
It is, yes. And then I think astrology nowadays it doesn't fit already in this category, perhaps, but for a long time in historical tradition, in historical research tradition, people didn't really consider astrology something worthy of knowing or worthy of such the complexity that in fact it has. So they thought they wouldn't need to understand. It was something so base, so superstitious, so primitive that automatically they, being fluent in mathematics or being learned men and women, would understand it very well. And it's not the case, because then you go into a technical complexity that you very well know that it's not that easy to understand, even sometimes for someone who's more has more knowledge of the inner workings of astrology. And nowadays, we finally can discuss this kind of complexities that we were just having now. So, for example, the fact that directions are not being transmitted into the specific context while they exist almost continuously throughout a Western tradition. And this is a highly complex topic within astrology itself. We're already into the inner settings and workings of the knowledge.
And I think what you said there is very important, that if you some scholars, and I wish I could say scholars of an earlier era, but actually there are still scholars like that.
They're still around.
Yes, almost take a pride in not knowing the practical side of astrology at all. I heard people say in a sort of self-congratulatory manner that I have no idea how astrology is used in practice.
Yeah.
And it's similar to what I heard at one point, someone quoting a professor in Paris, I think it was, who said, "Well, I've never spoken to a student outside of the lecture hall." But in the introduction to this book, I mentioned Albrecht Weber, who in the mid-19th century actually wrote not only on Pajika, but on this particular work that I've now edited and translated, the Hayamaratna. And but he explicitly says that what he did was quite extraordinary for his time, and he was the only one who gave any sort of attention to this work and this tradition. But he still says in one sentence that dealing with what he calls the practical aspects of astrology, which means the actual content of astrology, is neither my office nor my wish. Is it? It's sort of he really wants to keep it at a distance.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to be associated with it because it would taint him with a taint of superstition.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a prevalent attitude until almost the end of the 20th century, when things start to shift around a little bit more. Yes.
If you're not getting into the technical contents, then you're really going to misunderstand things.
Yes. Even from a mathematical perspective, because even if your focus is the history of mathematical astronomy, for example, if you don't understand the calculations that are involved in certain techniques, especially directions, profection, those techniques which will need computation of planetary positions to work, if you don't know how they work and what calculations are involved, then you still are misunderstanding what would be the mathematical requirements that someone would need to be practicing this kind of knowledge. So you're missing out on something that might be crucial for your research, because as we know today very well, and it has been a hard thing to be accepted by certain pockets of the history of science, is that astrology in many contexts was the catalyst for the production of instruments, tables, and a number of auxiliary tools that would be needed for its practice. So a lot of the advancements, technological, if we want to call them advancements, in astronomy and mathematical astronomy, and in mathematics itself, also were promoted by an extensive practice of astrology. And I think that is becoming more obvious into academia, although there is still this reticence in accepting this, well, as if it would deny mathematics or astronomy legitimacy, or which is absurd because we cannot judge things from that point of view. It's historically incorrect. But still, I think this attitude is dissipating.
Slowly, but
Yeah.
hopefully, surely, yes.
Yeah. That's cool. Another question that I would like to ask you is, I know this is a complex answer, but what do you think are the main differences that we found, also the more obvious differences between the original knowledge where Tajika comes from, and then it's this Hindu interpretation of the Perso-Arabic tradition? Where do you find the most obvious differences? We talk about, for example, the planetary periods, where certainly they gain a complexity which makes them more similar to what already exists in the Hindu tradition. But are there other notable differences
between the original
Persian Arabic and then the Hindu interpretation, so the Tajik tradition at this point, because we already have, as you said, 400 years of digestion and rethinking and commenting on all this technique and practice?
Well, one thing that I think is really striking, and which is actually a difference that seems to have come about very early on, is that one part of the tradition that was transmitted seems to have died out, and that is the practice of natal astrology or genealogy as a whole. Now, we mentioned, I think, a little while ago that astrology was transmitted twice to India. Horoscopic astrology was transmitted first from the Hellenistic area in the early centuries of the Common Era, and then about 1,000 years later, it came again via the Perso-Arabic culture. So by the time that the second transmission took place, the original form of astrology that had been transmitted to India had been completely naturalized. It was viewed not as something of Greek origin, but as something that was Indian, Indian India. And there were large enough differences between this Indian, what we might call classical Indian or pre-Islamic Indian astrology on the one hand, and the new Perso-Arabic tradition, Tajika, on the other hand, sufficiently large differences for Tajika to evolve into a separate school. So they weren't merged. Sometimes people, including Balabhadra, that is my author, practiced both and wrote books about both, but they didn't try to combine them.
Okay.
So they kept them separate. So Balabhadra wrote this large work called Hayanaratna, and he wrote a second work 5 years later called Horaratna, which is basically the same sort of work, but on pre-Islamic style Indian astrology. So Tajika was preserved as a separate tradition. And as far as I've been able to make out, the most important person to write about Tajika in the early phase was someone called Samarasimha, who lived in the 13th century in Gujarat, in Western India. And he seems to have written first 3 semi-independent works, which were transmitted together and were just called Samarasimha Shastra, that is the teaching of Samarasimha, or Tajika Shastra, the Tajika teaching, so quite generic titles. But then presumably at a somewhat later stage, he, my guess is he got hold of new sources that he didn't have at first, and he wrote a new work, which he called the Karma Prakasha, or Light on Actions, which is a book on genethliology, so natal astrology. The original text that he wrote, the three parts of that text were, first, one part on basic definitions, like describing the different essential, what we know as essential dignities, and the different kinds of configurations of the planets and the lots, which was a completely new thing in India. The lots hadn't been transmitted from the Hellenistic world. So a few things like that. So basic definitions, and then the second part was on interrogations, that is horary astrology, and the third part was on annual revolutions, what is known today as solar returns. But then later on, he wrote this book that was specifically on casting natal horoscopes, and which covered all the usual things about longevity and all the various aspects that you want to aspects of life that you want to judge, wealth and
prosperity, children, vocation.
Actually, some of those are actually conspicuously missing. So I believe that there are some chapters, even of that work, there are some chapters missing. But nevertheless, it seems that this second work of Samarasimha's on genethliology wasn't lost, because we still have it, but it wasn't transmitted at all as on as large a scale as his earlier works. So basically, seems to have been no Tajika tradition on genethliology as such, but rather Tajika came to be associated in India with two things mainly. That is horary astrology, answering questions, which, in case any of the listeners don't know exactly what that is, it's not got nothing to do with your birth horoscope, but rather you come to the astrologer with a practical problem or question, like my cow has disappeared. Where is my cow? And the astrologer casts a chart for the time and place where you ask the question, and then he says she's in the next village, to the northwest or whatever. So you will find her in 3 days' time. So that's horary astrology, and the other area is annual revolutions. So annual horoscopes, what is sometimes called in the academic literature anniversary horoscopes. You cast a new horoscope for each year of life. So it's a sort of paradoxical situation that there is no Tajika work, or at least not in common circulation, on how to judge a birth horoscope, but only on how to judge the anniversary horoscopes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to to ask you. Yeah, something's missing there.
Something's missing. So it's like building a house from the second story.
Yeah.
So people who just wanted their birth chart done would have to get it done in the pre-Islamic Indian style. But and I think that is probably one reason why many people practice both kind of astrology.
Okay. So they were getting different aspects of the analysis from traditions.
They needed to cast the basic birth chart and get a sort of bird's eye view. They needed the traditional pre-Islamic sort of Indian astrology, because that was what there was. That was what was available. But then they also found value in this casting of annual horoscopes, because that enabled them to go into much more detail in their predictions.
Okay. Which is something which is not present at all in the first tradition, the older tradition. Okay.
They rely on planetary periods, which of course can be, in theory at least, they can be subdivided into very minute periods. So you can say you're in the major period of Jupiter, and the sub period of Mars, and the sub period of Saturn, and the sub, etc. But it gets unwieldy. And then they did use transits as well, so which is the real life or real time movements of the planets. But they didn't have these intermediate stage techniques like the annual revolutions. So that was something that they really seized upon and saw as the great contribution of Tajika. So yeah, that's a major difference.
Yes, indeed. And now something popped up to my mind, and we're talking about the same structure of calculation in both traditions. So sidereal zodiac with whole sign houses. So the calculation of the original chart is the same for both traditions. They simply apply then different techniques to its interpretation. Is that correct?
Yes, more or less. I would say that this point about whole sign houses actually, I mean, many authors don't go into which house system to use. Okay. Because they're writing a book on annual astrology, and they sort of presuppose that you know all this stuff already. But Balabhadra, for instance, who is thorough, he goes into it and he uses quadrant houses. Okay. He uses the standard Indian system of quadrant houses, which is what is known in the West as porphyry houses. In India, it's called Shripati, named after an if I remember correctly, 11th century astronomer, astrologer. So it uses the porphyry cusps, but then they don't use them quite the same way as it's commonly done in the West, but they use them as midpoints of the houses. It's a bit different. There is actually an example, at least one example that is known to me from quote-unquote the Western tradition. It's a Hellenistic astrologer named Pancarius, who apparently did the same. But anyway, Balabhadra uses quadrant houses, and I think many of them actually did the same, at least when they wanted to be thorough. But it was much easier to use whole sign houses. And
that's interesting, because you do have more or less the authors in the Iberian Peninsula who are working in the 10th, 12th century, also stating, I don't recall exactly which one of them says this, but they state that if you I think they say something like the Maghrebi use what we would call today the porphyry system, but which is okay for a general interpretation, but if you want precision, you have to use, and then I think he states Alcibiades, because it's more precise, and it's a variation of exactly the same position. It's okay for a general interpretation, but then precision requires a more. There's this idea that precision requires a more mathematical, complex system.
Yeah, this is Balabhadra actually has a discussion of this. Because this ties into very much into the practical business of casting a chart and of representing. We're used especially in the modern Western style of astrology, we're used to seeing the sign placements and the house placements of the planets in the same charts. There's just one chart. But the standard Indian way of doing this is having a basic chart, which is called the Rashi Kundali, or the sign chart, which shows the positions of the planets and the ascendant in the signs.
Okay.
And then, if you want to go into into things with greater precision, you cast you make a second figure, which also has 12 divisions, but these are the quadrant houses, and you put the planets into that, and that's called the Bhava Kundali, or the house chart. So you've got the sign chart and the house chart. And Balabhandra is explicit in saying that house results, that is the results of planets in different houses, are judged from the house chart. And everything else, that is aspects and essential dignities and so on, are judged from the sign chart.
Okay.
So he goes into that explicitly.
Right. So it's a completely way of arranging data and structuring data visually, which of course it will emphasize different aspects of the same thing.
And it's the same thing if you go to an Indian astrologer today. I mean, not just a Tajik astrologer, but any astrologer in India. He or she will cast your Rashi Kundali as your sign chart, and then if they want to be exact, they will cast the house chart. And of course, these days, many, or perhaps even many anyway, Indian astrologers will have a computer and will use a computer program which generates all these charts in the blink of an eye.
Okay.
Which wasn't the case even 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So it did require time and effort, and so they would try to do as much as possible with a minimum of calculation, and then they.
Yes. I think that's a general problem in the history. A question, not a problem, but a general issue within the history of astrology, being it in an Indian context or in a Western context, is the complexity of the practice.
Yes.
Is dependent on the ability or the mathematical / astronomical knowledge of the practitioner. The more knowledge you have and the more education you have on that subject, perhaps the more use you can do of complex calculations. If you're not as knowledgeable, you will stick to what you can calculate with a minimum precision. And I think that also somehow changes practice and gives us sometimes wrong ideas as to exactly what they were doing, because perhaps we're looking at the same thing, but done by people who are more knowledgeable of calculation and those who are less knowledgeable and cannot apply certain number of techniques. And I think that's a transversal problem throughout the whole history of astrology. And I think it's something that has to be addressed in more detail at some point. That would be a wonderful topic of research by itself. Yes, but what's quite fascinating, seeing this kind of interaction of the two. Yes, and well, I think your contribution, and it is a huge contribution, because it's clear that even just the translation itself, it's a major work, and it's a lot of work to try to understand exactly all those terminologies, all those abbreviations. I understood by your introduction and the notes that you do that sometimes it's very difficult to really understand how they are transcribing or transliterating certain terms that come from the Persian, the Arabic, and other traditions. And I think it's quite a feat. And I think it's wonderful to have a new source. I'm always very fond of new sources. Excellent, and it can be quite, I think, useful, not only for those studying these particular traditions and the history of these traditions, but also for comparative study of how the same set of ideas, which in practice, if we reduce all of this to a core set of practices, they are the same in all these traditions, how they development and have specific cultural, scientific, religious adaptations depending on the environment, the cultural environment in which they're flourishing. So Martin, again, my congratulations for your work, and I thank you very much for having the time to come here and to talk a little bit about this work. And I would ask you now, what are your future projects? Do you intend to publish more on this topic? Or are you exploring at this point?
Well, I would be happy to explore the Tajika tradition a little more, especially the earliest phase. I have thought about trying to collect and edit and translate whatever there is of the preserved writings of Samarasingha. But at the moment, I feel like I need a bit of a break from Tajika. I started thinking about this project back in 2010. I first applied for funding in 2012, and I was, from time to time, was jotting down translations of individual passages and like that. But then I worked on it more or less full time from 2015 to the end of 2017. So for 3 years, I did have fun. But then it was, the last bit took much longer than I thought. A friend told me about the 90-90 rule that is sometimes quoted in programming, computer programming contexts. That the first 90% of the work takes 90% of the time, and the last 10% of the work also takes 90%.
90%. Yeah, it's true.
That applies not only to programming but to philology as well.
Yes, and a lot of other things. I think a lot of other research will fall into that. The last segment takes almost forever. Yeah, that's true.
So I've been doing this, intensely for the past 5 years, and then just less intensely for another 5 years before that. So I feel I need a bit of a break. Want to do something else, and the thing I'm trying to get funding for at the moment is a sort of intercultural study of length of life prognostication, astrological prognostication of the length of life, where I want to focus not only on India or on Tajika or something like that, but I actually want to look at the Greek language sources, and then their especially their reception in the furthest eastern and the furthest western areas of transmission, which is to say India and the Latin West. So I'd like to make an in-depth study of that particular area, because it's really it's such just from the point of view of astrological history of astrology, it's a really central area of astrological doctrine.
Yes.
As you know, it's traditionally was the first thing that an astrologer was supposed to do on casting a birth chart, finding out the length of life. Because without knowing that, you can't make any predictions.
Yeah, it's one of those techniques that if you don't find in a manual, you find it strange, because it's usually a chapter that's included in every discussion of practical horoscopy.
Exactly. So from the point of view of just the astrology or the history of astrology, it's really central doctrine, but people haven't really focused on it, and I think mainly for two reasons. One is that it's quite technically complex a lot of the time, and another is, of course, that we have sort of in the modern West we have a cultural taboo against reminders of mortality. We don't want to talk about it, you know.
Yeah, it's not it's not a light subject.
There's nothing you can do about it, so at least you can shut up, you know, not
Exactly.
remind yourself. So, but I do think it should be addressed.
Yeah.
And also, I think, speaking as a historian of religion, taking a broader view, I think it's interesting to explore, going back to what we talked about right at the beginning of this chat, the dividing lines between the history of religion and the history of science. Where does one end and the other begin? And especially where do they meet and commingle, and what are these areas of no man's land that you mentioned? Because that is those can be really important. I mean, I do think not just for historians of astrology, but for anyone who's interested in the intellectual history of well, both of Asia and of Europe. Understanding the contributions of astrology is really important. So there's a gap that I think needs to be filled.
Yes, of course. The heavens are ever-present cultural experience in every human population around the globe, and of course we immediately have the religious component of worship, of spirituality connected to the heavens, but then we also have astrology and its interpretation, its understanding, and sometimes that little bit gets less attention. Yes. As we were talking. Yeah. So yes, I think.
So that's my plan, or that's my hope anyway. That someone will have the some funding body somewhere will have the foresight actually to see that this is an area of research. This should be done, and to let me do it.
Yes, and I well, let's hope that someone does have that insight and that ability to understand the importance, because it is a point. I think that point in particular, it's quite interesting for the conversion of this of belief, spirituality, and science, because here you have a good a good point of encounter with death in that.
Exactly, yes.
In that practice, so I think that's an excellent choice, and I wish you all the luck and all the possibilities of you taking that project ahead will go forward in the future. Well, Martin, thank you very much for the wonderful conversation. It's always interesting to know new aspects of the astrological tradition. The context in which you work, it's something I'm not familiar with. I don't just know little bits. So it's always interesting to have this, and of course to have a source which we can then read, understand how these practices are produced and transmitted in other contexts. So thank you very much, and the best of success for all your projects.
Likewise. Thank you.